Hi, my name is Legacy Russell. I'm the Associate Curator of Exhibitions at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and it's my great pleasure to be here today with Garrett Bradley on the occasion of her exhibition, Projects Garrett Bradley at the Museum of Modern Art, as presented by the Studio Museum. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize the lead sponsor of film at MoMA, Chanel, for their generous and dedicated support, which makes possible all of the museum's film programming. And of course, a very warm welcome to MoMA's members tuning in. Thank you for your ongoing support of MoMA. If you're not already a member, consider becoming one at moma.org/join for special access to virtual cinema and other engaging experiences all year round. So now we'll get started. Garrett, we're here on a very special occasion of the opening of your first New York institutional solo show. This exhibition is organized by the Studio Museum in Harlem as part of a multi-year partnership with the Museum of Modern Art. And the presence in this moment, in the midst of what has been an absolutely insane and wild year, is significant and special as the film intersects beautifully with your film Time, entering a global stage, and to the themes across time in America, which of course are incredibly resonant. In January of this year, you also won a very special award, recognized as the first Black woman ever to win Best Director at Sundance for your nonfiction film, Time. So in your words, can you tell us a little bit about the film? What are some of its central questions?
Well, there's so many questions, but also I hope revelations in the process of watching the film. I think that for me, Time came out of making another film, a short 13-minute film called Alone. And that really actually came out of my first film, Below Dreams, which came out in 2014. And I'd become very close with the folks that were in Below Dreams. And Desmond being one of them, and I became even closer with his partner, Lon. And when he was arrested and awaiting trial in what ended up being about 1.5 years in a private prison, right, this is pre-trial, so non-constitutional, it became very clear that Lon was, not only did she become sort of a single mother overnight, but she also was managing the disappearance of somebody that she loved and the disappearance of a person, and didn't have a lot of people to go to, didn't have a lot of family members or friends because of the stigma associated with being in love with somebody who's incarcerated and just being an incarcerated family. And so I had conceived of that film as being sort of a series of intergenerational conversations between women who were also in incarcerated relationships, and thinking that the film itself could sort of be a space of exchange, a space of support between women, and then thereby anybody watching the film could also gain hopefully the same kinds of things. So I contacted an organization called FLIC, Friends and Families of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children, and Gina Womack, who's the co-founder and director of that organization, picked up the phone and said, the first person you have to speak with is Fox Rich. And so Alone as a short film started off with a series of questions, and those questions being basically creating space for questions and space for exchange. And so Fox, she makes a very vivid connection between slavery and the prison industrial complex at the end of that film, and I got to know her in the process of making Alone. And it became really important for me to think about how, as a filmmaker, I could continue to address the issue of incarceration from a standpoint that was sort of inherently feminist, that was really leaning on the effects of the facts, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that some of the central questions or themes that exist in the film are pointing to what it means for an entire population to be invisible, and that in many cases, the only evidence of 2.3 million people being incarcerated, the only proof of that is in the family, is in those that are serving time also on the outside. And hopefully, there are many, many questions, and as I said, revelations that then exist within the specificity of their story as the Richardsons as well.
Absolutely. I mean, so we have this incredible protagonist, Sybil Fox Richardson, who is fondly known as Fox across the film. And I think what is important to kind of note is her relationship to time, within time, how she expands it, how she breaks it, how she challenges and refuses it. Can you talk a little bit about Fox's relationship to time over the course of her work and as well her presence in the film as it works across a kind of resistance against carcerality?
Yeah, I mean, so Robert was incarcerated for 21 years. And I think that it kind of actually leads into the question of the archive, actually, most immediately, because, you know, when I met Fox, it was 18 years into the process of Robert being incarcerated. And, you know, the way she talks about it is that she was very much at sort of a point of feeling frustrated is not even the word. There really is probably no word for what it means when you are not giving up and you can tell that there's no one around you that cares the same way that you care, right? And I think that when she was released from prison herself, she had her own revelation of what it means to use her voice. And to essentially build her own archive and to build space for herself as she saw herself as an individual, and the way she saw her family. And so I think on one hand, the video archive is addressing time in the sense that it was her finding a form of therapy for herself. But I also think it was a way in which she was redefining the American dream, which was also the very thing that got them in the trouble that they were in, redefining what a wholesome American family is and looks like. Some of my favorite moments in the archive are actually of her giving direction to Remington and Lawrence, her two oldest sons, on how to hold the camera and how to frame the camera.
Which I just love because she's the ultimate director.
She's like, yes, exactly. And she's directing them, and she's saying you have the right to see things the way that you want to see them, you know? You can guide yourself in the world the way that you want to. And I think resistance and one's relationship to time manifests itself in a variety of ways throughout the film. And it really kind of boils down actually to the initial conversation that she and I had with Robert as well and with the entire family before we even started filming, which was, why do we want to make this film? For me, that's important anytime I'm making a documentary, to get to know why it's meaniful. What is it that, because not everyone would want a camera around them like all the time, right? So if one is open to it, it must be that they have something to say, that there is a real impetus for what they plan on sharing with the world, right? And so for them, it was very clear, you know, they said our story is the story of 2.3 million American families, and we feel that our story can offer hope. And so I felt like my job then as a filmmaker was to sort of, assuming that I was also in alignment with what that goal was and purpose was to then distill this idea of hope, which can be very vague, and try to find it in its specificity in their story. And I think it is always in relationship to time. It is their ability to stay united as a family over the course of 21 years, their resistance to the sort of systematic separation of Black families from the beginning of time in America, their ability to hold on to their sense of individuality, their sense of self amidst a system that is strategically attempting to destruct that constantly, and then love, you know, like just love in and of itself, which is not chronological, has no chronology to it, is not linear. Those were the sort of the three pillars of the film that are them inherently, and I think also shaped the film itself, the structure of it, you know.
I think what's remarkable is that stat of 2.3 million. Mm-hmm. I want to take a moment maybe to just kind of let that sink in, most particularly because it points to the reality that this is not a story that exists at the margins, that it's a story that exists within our everyday, that it is a story that is everywhere, all around us, all the time. And so part of what the film does is make that visible and known. Mm-hmm. And we watch Fox really kind of engage that history, think critically as well, through the lens of a kind of abolitionist framework. Mm-hmm. And to do that through this framework, too, of longing, she is, you know, empowered and driven by this want and love that she has for her partner. And we see that in the actual film, the incredible directing that you do and the intimate moments that are shared, but also we hear that in the sound. The sonic frequencies of the film are deeply powerful. Can you talk about the score and how that came together?
Yeah. So the score, I wish I had known who Emma Hoy was before YouTube, but I had all of these playlists, these 1970s Ethiopian playlists on YouTube, and Emma Hoy's music just popped up. Like, it was just the algorithm that just gave it to me as a gift.
And it's so beautiful.
Yeah, and I immediately was struck by it. And when Gabe Rhodes and I, who cut the film, put it to picture, it felt sort of cosmic and like it was meant to be, right? But I think what really helped me, what really kind of sealed the deal for me in terms of like, this is the score of the film, was when I really learned about who Emma Hoy was. And she's a 96-year-old Ethiopian nun. She's still alive. She has an incredible story. She came from a very wealthy family in Ethiopia and was then a prisoner of war and was a sort of pianist prodigy, and was classically trained in Western music, and decided instead of sort of having a career, she would go back to Ethiopia, and she essentially created her own genre of music, which is this incredible blending of both Western and Ethiopian melody. And she, the one recording that she ever did of her music was this recording, which was done in 1963 for the purpose of raising money for an orphanage. And also, just when you think about the significance of what was happening in America in 1963 and her sort of recording this in 1963, I loved the idea of bringing these two women together in space and time as sort of radicals in their own right, you know? And it guides us. And Jameson Shaw also did some original score at the very end of the film, which felt really important that we needed to have a shift, because I think that there's a certain linearity and flow to Emma Hoy's music that was crucial to, it was sort of the saran wrap around the film, you know? It held it together because we are not bound by chronology from a sort of picture standpoint, you know, editorially. And so the music needed to be guided in that way. But then there's a break, right? There's a shift that happens. And I think Jameson did a beautiful job of addressing that and also sort of collaborating with Emma Hoy in that way.
I am thinking back on one of my favorite scenes in the film, where we see Fox getting her hair done, and it is from the back of her head. And I remember the first time watching Time and just being so struck by how much of cinema exists in that one frame. I want to maybe have you think a little bit with us about some of your influences, because I know that those histories are rich and deeply informed in your practice and engage how you see the world, and as well encourage us to see things in new and exciting ways. So can you talk a little about that and maybe give us some clues about who you've been watching along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, first of all, thank you. That's just like such a profound compliment, and I received that. I feel that. Thank you. You know, I think I went to film school, and everybody has a different relationship to going to film school. For me, it was really critical. It was the only way in which I was going to get my hands on like a big camera, not just my hi8 camcorder that I was shooting films in high school with. You know, and it was a way to actually like build community, you know, to meet people, other filmmakers who I could help in their pursuit, they could help me, and to have mentors specifically in the field of filmmaking. And when I was at UCLA, I met Billy Woodbury there. And I think that, you know, something that I was feeling when I was in the program, I'll just backtrack for a second, that I was feeling in the program that I think a lot of students who are in graduate programs maybe start to feel towards the end of the program is a bit of like frustration, resistance to the program. And I think that actually is a good thing. It's sort of a sign that you are finding yourself, you know, that you have something to resist against, sort of, or alongside, I should say. And I really struggled with trying to see myself in the films that I was seeing, that I knew about, even in just sort of the structure of how films are traditionally made, was not something that I was working for me. And by that, I mean that there was sort of this idea that you have a thesis in sort of traditional filmmaking. You have a thesis, you have a story, you have an idea, and then the entirety of production is there to protect that thesis, right? So there isn't a whole lot of wiggle room for change. You have a lot of change, constant change in the process of making the film, but you are sort of tooth and nail moving with the change and adjusting in order to maintain this one idea, right? And to me, that doesn't feel like an intuitive way to make films. It's probably why I find documentary filmmaking or working sort of in the real world so gratifying, right? But I think when I was watching films by Julie Dash, by Charles Brunet, that entire kind of movement that was also pulled from post-Italian, like neorealism, post-war cinema, which was very much about getting outside of the studio, right? Because the studios didn't exist after the war, having to be on the street, having to work with non-professional actors, having to really sort of make your resources work for you. And that being adapted in a very American context, in a Black American context, was incredibly inspiring, both for its, I guess on a sort of practical sense, right? But also in ways that are a little bit harder, just in terms of what they evoke, I should say. Because there are these moments where when you're watching like Killer of Sheep, for instance, where there's nothing that's explicitly stating or saying or addressing the history, the American history, right? No one's saying that slavery has a profound impact on our current identities,
right,
or landscapes, but we understand that inherently, and yet there's still a profound sense of authorship and autonomy and beauty that is in front of the camera. And I felt like when I was watching those films, I was coming home to something, and it was both a coming home to and also finding myself to a certain extent. So I think that had the most, and also, I mean, William Greaves had such a profound impact on just having permission to fucking make whatever I want to make, honestly, you know? I mean, Take One was like, the first time I saw that film, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Like, and it wasn't eye candy. It was deeply, deeply profound. There were so many different layers to the brilliance of that film that I could go on, but I think that they're probably in everything I make on some level. Yeah.
I think that allows us to actually pivot beautifully to this question of the archive, because, you know, what you've shared with us just now is thinking very much so about the archive that kind of exists within your learning, your imagination, what has shaped your kind of viewfinder, if you will, right? But as well, I know that across America, which is, you know, now on view here at MoMA, and time, that the archive plays a very particular role. For America, Lime Kiln is center stage, a special film, given that it exists in the archive of the Museum of Modern Art, and then is kind of reactivated, re-engaged, expanded through this work, America, that allows for it to live in a new historical context. Within time, you have the gift of this incredible archive that comes into your possession to use within the film, alongside and in collaboration with Fox and her family. So can you talk a little bit about, you know, what is the archive to you? What does that mean to kind of construct different types of imaginations, sort of futures, propose new structures, and as well have it exist maybe as a uniquely Black vernacular?
Yeah, I mean, I think with both films, and I think starting with America, because America was made before time, and I think that they're certainly in conversation with each other, but I was working through the Rubik's Cube, and I think figured some things out by the time I was in time. You know, part of the like exciting challenge of making films to me is that you are working in two-dimensional space, you're working with a screen, and you can only tell a story or move a narrative forward like one frame at a time. And that is in complete contradiction to how we actually live life and the way in which we understand history, the way in which we move through the world, who we are as human beings, which is 360 degrees, you know? So there were things about, when I was looking at Lime Kiln specifically, there were things that I knew both intuitively and just based on the research that the museum had done and that I had read, which was what it took to make a film over 100 years ago as a Black performer. That was what the museum thinks is the very first feature-length film with an all-Black cast and integrated production team. So you had white people and Black people working together toward a sort of Black vision several years after Plessy versus Ferguson, so the beginning of Jim Crow, right? when I was making America, also, we started off in Obama's administration. As I was finishing it, we were in Trump's administration. So there were certain things I couldn't take for granted. And it was really important for me that I prove what I knew to the viewer, that he was coming from a place of power. Yes, he's in blackface, right? But no one else around him is in blackface. And we get a real sense that there is sort of what you and myself and Thelma were talking about, this idea of there being sort of a nostalgia for the future, right? You very much sense that everyone in the crew and the production knew they were doing something incredibly progressive and powerful and beautiful, and you just feel that it's palpable. So how could I prove that and make that sort of abundantly clear? That was the challenge with America, right? And it's fixed. It's something that you didn't shoot it, you don't have any control over it. So it's all about the context. It's all about how you're using time and pace. And I remember literally at one point, just going through the film frame by frame and that's why that piece starts off with still images. And the very first image is of Bert not in costume, right? So we understand him as a character, first and foremost. And then we go through these still images that are unequivocally him giving direction and in a place of control. And I think with time, it was a similar kind of challenge, but different, because obviously Fox, I'm intimately connected with her. She's alive, right? This isn't like she isn't someone who was alive 100
different
years
type of
ago.
conversation, yeah.
Yeah, we could have a dialogue. But when I was shooting it, I remember, because I really thought I was making a short film, like a 13-minute short film. And I remember, like, on our last day of filming, saying to Fox, like, okay, I'm going to be back and I'll show you what I have. And she handed me what ended up being 100 hours of her own personal archive that I didn't know existed. So I had to completely reconceive and rethink what it was I was making. And the beauty of it was that I knew at that moment, I knew when I was shooting the film, prior to understanding that the archive existed, that I was only reaching one dimension of the story, and Fox herself, as I mentioned earlier, talked about where she was emotionally at that point. There was a lot of armor around her, right? Necessary armor, that's required when you're going through the system in the way that she was, for the amount of time that she was, what it means to present yourself in front of parole boards year after year after year, right? So it was like, I knew that she was a free spirit. I knew that there was a huge amount of joy and love and playfulness, but I didn't have a lot of that, right? So the archive, to a certain extent, that same challenge of proving it presented itself, and the archive offered the 360 degrees, and that was really critical. And I think when you look at both of the films next to each other, we also kind of understand this idea of performance as being, specifically as sort of as a Black experience in America, as being a form of both oppression and resistance, all in one. And I think that those two themes run very clearly in the film, and I'd like to think of them as coming from a place of authority and power.
I love thinking about the idea of the archive performing in its own right. That, with Fox giving you this power to do this work with her, that was part of her power, right? That kind of exchange was one that enters into a kind of different type of social contract. It allows for perhaps an opportunity to have a conversation that can be expansive and push further this notion of time as not being linear. So I'm wondering about, this question of a kind of collective future, most particularly because you engage collective practice so much throughout, time and America both. And so maybe as a ending question to think through, as we are gearing up for the opening of Your America, is to wonder maybe aloud about what shape collective time takes and how that might be informing or driving both this particular moment, but also, existing as a proposition, as a provocation. Are there ways to, make and break and resist time? As well as we look at Fox and are so inspired by her, thinking about time through the lens of a love and desire, right? That perhaps that is the thing that can bend and expand it. But what do you think, Garrett?
Wow. Well, there's two things. One, I'm going to answer it in a kind of a boring way, which is in terms of structure really quickly, which is just that, and something I had sort of forgot to mention, but I think also goes into this idea of collectivity. But with both America and Time, the question is like, when are you coming in and out of the archive, right? And I think that this question of love and what Fox had created within the unit of her family was not bound by time, and that was the resistance. That was the power.
It was expansive. It was cosmic.
Cosmic, expansive, nonlinear. And so those were sort of the basic principles by which myself and Gabe decided when we were going to come in and out of time. So that allowed the work to sort of move forward while also going backwards at the same time, because it was bound by these sort of more abstract qualities, right?
And almost by default, the kind of checkpoints along the way that she had to go through, that were very linear, right? That she came up against. Her moving in this way that was fluid and fractal, and at points, engaged a different level of sort of elasticity, was something that allowed for her to skirt and kind of renegotiate with some of these structures that we may see as being super fixed and rigid.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think that feeds into this thing of collectivity, the way that you've asked about that, because I think that collectivity and what its role is in the future or in this present moment is that we are all coming from these subjective spaces, right? And when we come into the same space, when we're in dialogue with one another, we get the full picture, And I think that is, again, not only a beautiful idea and something to work towards in real life, in the real world, but also in the process of making films, right? And that films are ultimately trying to do that against the limits of its own form. So it's an ongoing lifetime challenge.
It's a huge challenge, but we're here for it and up for it. So thank you so much, Garrett, and thank you for your incredible time and also for your incredible America. We're so looking forward to viewing both in these months ahead.
Thank you, Legacy. I so appreciate you. Thank you.